I guess I'll just start. Hello, I'm Jeanie Dean, and this is the Milwaukee Theosophical Society. And tonight's talk is Sacred Geometry Part 4. And you're thinking, now wait a minute, what happened to Part 3? Well, last session was 2 and 3 together, and we talked a bit about paradoxes. So there was a paradox of how 3 morphed into 2. So now we're on 4. And with all these researches I've been doing, very interesting things emerge. And I worked on this quite a bit, and then at the last minute had nothing ready, prepared, produced. And then I came up with like 200 pieces of information for you today. So we'll see how we get through it. But one of the things I discovered is the importance and significance of water in terms of, and the topic is sacred geometry and sacred architecture. And so we'll keep an eye out as we're looking at, basically we're looking at a tour of sites around the world, and we'll keep an eye out for water issues and kind of come to that at the end. So there's the Acropolis with the Parthenon on it, and sacred geometry and sacred architecture. I want to recap what we did in 1 and 2. We talked about geometric forms and numbers. We talked about principles of, and so we're going to come back to that. So we're going to look at principles of sacred architecture, the pyramids, Greek and Roman sacred sites, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, and other Mesopotamian sites, Hindu, Buddhist, and native earth sites, and then the business of hydraulic empires. So to recap, part 1 was about the genesis of numbers, and we looked at geometry and the first dimension of numbers. The second dimension was solids, polygons, and polyhedra. We looked at the paradox of 0, and we looked at the genesis of feminine circular forms and the importance of the Vesica Pisces as a tool and instrument in developing principles or rules for geometry. And part 2 we looked at going from that to the flower of life, and here we have an image of the stages of the many facets of the flower of life. And then we looked at Metatron's cube, which is a figure that encodes and encases the flower of life, as well as all the 5 Platonic solids. And that there was references to it in the Book of Enoch, which is a very pivotal work of transmission from the divine to the human race. And we looked at the Merkaba, which is a connected form that has been described also in the Book of Enoch as a chariot and a combination of light, spirit, and body. And we looked at Platonic solids, and there they are, the 5. The tetrahedron, the cube, the octahedron, the icosahedron, and the dodecahedron. And we looked at some of the factors for these, how many faces they have, the points, the edges, the sum of the degrees in them. And so for the tetrahedron, it's a symbol of fire and 180 degrees with a volume of 720. The octahedron is air with a total of 1440 degrees, the famous 12 squared. And for the hexahedron, earth, we saw that it has 2160 degrees. And for water, for the icosahedron ruled by water, the total is 3600 degrees. And finally, the dodecahedron is 6480. And we saw that in many cases, these numbers recur again and again related to timekeeping and other measures of the planet. We looked at the Fibonacci series and the number Phi, and their symbol, and the Nautilus spiral, and how the Fibonacci series is related to 5 and the square root of 5. And we looked at the formula for it and how it's the ratio 1.618 ad infinitum. And here's the series of numbers, and there's the formula where we derive phi from the square root of 5. And we also in our study group saw how this comes up when we work with the Vesica Pisces or a rectangle and draw a diagonal through it. That also yields in hard, drawing figures and forms, that it also yields the Fibonacci number phi. So we also looked at time and measure, and this is where some of those numbers that we looked at before. And this particular glyph has the circumference of the Earth related to the octahedron and the icosahedron added together. And we saw also how 9 is an important figure in a lot of the work with Platonic solids and timekeeping. We saw that there's a couple significant numbers, 27, 32, 432, and 108. We looked at why the number system for 360 is so valuable. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I'm going to just kind of, maybe some of these screens are familiar, for the numbers for measurement of time, and the dimensions of the sun and the earth and the moon and how they're related to each other through a triangular form. So there's the earth, and that's the moon, and there's the sun. And one of the teachers that I've been studying says you have to get to a point where these numbers are in your head and as familiar as, how to do a Microsoft command on your computer or something, because then you can be more adept at finding them and observing them in the physical world, because they can turn up constantly. And for instance, the solar radius is 43,000 miles, and the solar diameter is 864, and these are key numbers that were on a previous slide, and we're not going to go backwards. To continue then, here's another view of the volume of some of these solids and how they relate to this business of time and measure and distance. So all 4 of these Platonic solids add up to be the diameter of the Earth. We looked at how 2732 is a very pivotal number related to the sun and the moon. The moon cycle is 27.3 days, and it's also this percentage of the size of the Earth, and among other things. We looked at the numbers further. This is more on 273. And there is a lot of information on 273 in the sun. And the sunspots are also 27.3 days. And again, something to encode in our kind of front brain. The number 432 is also significant, and it relates to sound and acoustics. And we're almost done with the review, you guys. And some of this, here's a formula for calculating the distance of the Earth, and goes back to the earliest Greeks. And then this was about how important 360 is, a number that we sort of inherited from the Babylonians, and how very significant it is in doing measures of time and space. So that takes us to Part 4, Sacred
You
Architecture.
forgot to mention the number of men.
Oh, 666. Yeah, there's a piece on that too. And I always said it was the population, the world population, and that was 6.66 billion in I think 2007 or so. And so that was the pivot point.
But the important point of that is how the platonic solids add up to it in relation.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that one, there was only 4, but when you add the 5th, it is that number. So in terms of sacred places and design, the temple is sort of our focus in this view, sacred sites. And so the temple is the house of God. It's the microcosm. Some view God as the divine architect of divine order and design, so an expression of God. And we on earth, we architects or artists, bring these concepts from heavenly realms and make them accessible to human experience. The word temple in Latin is templum, meaning sacred space, as officially surveyed and plotted ritually. So a temple has to be ordained, if you will. Another thing about sacred place and design is that it requires wealth and administration and bureaucracy. That large places of grandeur and communal respect are only occur in civilization and in urban areas where societies are fairly complex, and it requires intelligent engineers and workers. Some of these concepts of design are evident in traditions all over the world, like Feng Shui and the 5 elements, in the idea of the mandala, in native shamanic cults, in Confucianism, and in our whole Western tradition of art and architecture. We consider things like the elements, colors, materials, and acoustics, and so much more. Another thing is that some principles are emerging in the study of sacred architecture. However, it's really considered not an established field of study. So when researching it, there's a lot of renegade scholars out there, or people who aren't lettered, and but it'll probably turn into that. Like 20 years ago, archaeoastronomy was like a really renegade thing to be doing, and archaeoastronomy plays very much into the study of sacred places, and that has to do with looking at alignments of sites for astronomical events. So in terms of sacred architecture, site selection is important, and that has to do with that idea too of a temple being properly blessed and prepared ritually. Vitruvius, who is familiar from Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, and he was the Roman architect who wrote the book, literally, he wrote 10 books of architecture. And of course the Romans were quite big on architecture. So he said that sacred sites should be prominent, visible, and elevated. There's also and that's a concept that will occur. Another idea is the idea of the navel or the center of the world. For instance, Jerusalem considers themselves to be the navel of the world, as do other places. And in the Mormon Church of Latter-day Saints, in the 1800s, they reoriented their first temple to the west, even though they originally were orienting them differently for better visibility to the public. How vain. Oh well, we'll just throw out scripture. And other landscape features, rivers, lakes, mountains, forests, and islands, all can play a factor in site selection. The history of the place can be a factor. And so that's very big. The next category is orientation and direction. And Vitruvius said the architect must know many disciplines, astronomy, geography, etc., and must find the direction of the solar and stellar points for the building of a sacred place. For instance, east means higher awareness, and many of the Tibetan sites are oriented to the east, as Native American sites are. The west is death, and sound like Jim Morrison. But often, like in Egypt, the burial sites were on the west side of the Nile, and so looking west is the sunset. And the south is usually considered life-giving, and north is darkness and solitude. So those orientations become how you take the energy of the place. Chartres Cathedral faces northeast, and it's aligned to the summer solstice. The rose window in the cathedrals of most of the Gothic cathedrals faces either north or south. So then there's an east-west orientation for the transept. Time and space are important in orientation and direction. And for Mecca, or people who are practicing Islam, the location of Mecca is always important as a place to orient oneself for prayer. And Mormons in Utah, they all orient their address according to the relation to the temple, which is, you know, like ground zero in their cities. And we'll go on. So cosmic alignment is a third factor, which is different than direction. And for instance, we have Stonehenge has alignments with the equinox and the solstice, as many world sites do. The Egyptians aligned many of their sites to the North Star and Orion, as well as Asian Taoism was very interested in alignment with the North Star. The Mayan temples in Latin America tend to align to Venus, and the Venus points are their ratchet point for controlling the accuracy of their time measures. They use the Venus point for triangulation. So, and of course the Mayans have the most accurate timekeeping of any civilization. And the Hopis, for instance, they will be in a kiva, and a ceremony will be set to begin when the watcher who's watching the opening, and of course the kiva's down on the ground, is watching for when the star that signifies the ceremony is visible through a small opening in the kiva. So their ceremonies are aligned to begin with star points as well. So those are some examples of cosmic alignment. Another is spatial sequence, which has to do with the direction of movement. Is it straight through the temple? Like in Buddhism, up and inward is very consistent, so their sites go up and in. For the kiva, it's down and in. In the Jewish tradition, it's through a series of portals straight through to the Holy of Holies. In the Pantheon, it's a circular space in Rome. The activity tends to be circumambulation. And there are many Islamic sites, or as part of the Islamic tradition, is to circumambulate as well. Another factor is the principle of beauty. So perfection is seen near to divine, and so where nothing is needed or removed. And that includes ornamentation and images from nature, spirals, creatures, trees, and elements. And along with beauty is the idea of proportion, which takes us to our other linchpin, which is sacred geometry. And some examples of that in sacred architecture are the rose windows, the whole use of mosaics in mosque, and the calling on archetypes and stories and narrative. Another factor in principle of beauty is the sacred to the profane, which we see in some Hindu sites, or from dark to light as another example of that. So other principles then are archetype, symbols, stories, and ornament, the narratives of the heroes, the saints, the warriors, and the kings. The Sistine Chapel with the creation, the fall, the return to paradise, and the final judgment is an example. And symbols abound: the serpent, the snake, the sun, water, fire, and so on. I think I missed something. Now, how do I get back? Somehow I clicked it. Oh, here we go. So another is the whole idea of geometry, measure, proportion, and form. And some examples are the square is often used to represent earth, circles represent water or the mother, and rectangles are also take us right into the realm of geometric form, and triangles. Some of the factors with looking at that are the golden mean, and which is evident, for instance, in the Parthenon and many other sites as well. Another proportion is in the cathedral. It emulates Christ on the cross. The cathedral has a transept going through it. The Vitruvian Man. In Hindu sites, the sacred point in a site is where it would be comparable to the navel in a human being. Phi is evident in the Chart Cathedral. The ratio between the elevation of the site and the floor are completely parallel, such that the rose window is equal to where the labyrinth is on the floor. It's kind of interesting. And another factor is the relation of a site to other sites, like Stonehenge is related to Glastonbury and Avebury, and that's a big factor in timekeeping as well. The last one then is infrastructure, hegemony, and administration. So in order to build great sacred sites, we have to have an infrastructure, a power structure, and a bureaucracy to make that happen. So this is just repeating what we just went through: site selection, orientation, cosmic alignment, space, principles of beauty, archetypes, geometry, and then power. So, it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a specific field of study yet, but it probably will be. It's very holistic, it's multifaceted, it's interdisciplinary. Things like art history, archaeoastronomy, archaeology, geology, geometry, engineering and plain old construction, and religion itself. So it's an emergent study. So we'll begin, and this is a stupa, the Bodhana stupa, a Buddhist site. And so we'll begin with the Great Pyramid. And absolutely, it's the premier sacred site on the planet. And it encodes the measure of the planet. It encodes our system of timekeeping. And we could do a whole talk on just that. So we'll kind of skim it. And we looked at it a little bit in the last talk about it, and I kind of recycled some of that. For instance, the pyramid models longitude and latitude at a ratio of 1 to 43,200, so that's the factor. And there's that number that we looked at last time, again, 43,200. And so latitude is the parallel measure, and longitude's the long measure. And we can derive that number through the pyramid's measure. And so just some simple details about it. And it's 480 feet high, it's 736 at the base. Herodotus said the top pyramidion was gold or silver. What's kind of important is the 51.5 degrees angle of the pyramid. And that turns up in the Pentagon. And that 5150 is a factor having to do with the Mayan timekeeping, where they have the number 20, and again showing that they really did know their stuff. The numbers pi and phi are both indicated in the Great Pyramid, and I think I have a picture of that coming up. And here's a nice picture of the pyramid with the Sphinx in front of it. Wow. I've been studying, here's a little hook to water. I've been studying someone who is working on a theory that the Great Pyramid, in addition to being an incredible acoustic chamber and some sort of marker for the basic numeric units of measure for planet Earth, is also that a water pump and part of a water system. And there's gigantic tunneling underneath the pyramid, and they found it. I've talked with Hawi Zahas, and he was like very stumped by this pools of water under the Great Pyramid. And that's one theory, is that, and it's starting to hold water for me. In that, I mean, Egypt was the most dominant, I don't want to say culture, power in that area of the world for a long time. And they had grain, and they traded grain. They were growing wheat, and they had it. It's like what we were, the U.S. So everybody wanted to be trading partners with Egypt, and they had excellent water management. And so it may be not too crazy of an idea. Here's some more information about numbers encoded in the structure. So there's 432 again, and how that comes up with the royal cubit. I'm not going to belabor the deep math, and I'm not that great with it, but I have to think real hard. I know Stefan is. And here's another image showing both pi and phi in the Great Pyramid. And this is a nice graphic created by Scott Onstad, who did Hidden in Plain Sight, showing, let's see, he's got how this is in terms of squaring the circle. One of the things that happens with the Great Pyramid is that there's two measures for the base, and this factor between the measures of the base turns out to be very important. So it's paradoxical, and you can't ignore either one. And that gives us this business here, and that helps us come up with the number for the moon. And the reason why there's two numbers for the base is because there's a casing, so they can calculate the length, circumference with the casing and without, and it's significantly different, but not huge. And this factor of 273 comes up quite a bit in the math here with these two different, with this adjustment. And we saw that 4,320 was an important number. So there's another one. So moving on from the Great Pyramid, there are pyramids all over the world. This is Tikal in Guatemala. It's very tall and a very interesting site. And here are some other Mexican pyramids. Teotihuacan and El Tajín, which you don't hear much about, and that's in Veracruz. It's a smaller, this is it, the top one. And I of course had initiations into Mayan timekeeping, and I spent time at Chichen Itza in 1988, when the year after the harmonic convergence, and it was a full moon, and the shadow was cast on the face at night as well as in the daytime on the equinox. And
So was it like the snake going up or down?
well, the shadow is cast on the edge right here. And it's not this face and it's not that one, it must be the other face. There's a head of a dragon on the ground,
Right.
and so then you can see the shadow being cast on the ridge of the side of the stairwell. And so it's cast at night as well. But you're asking, is it reversed?
Yeah, I thought I saw something one time where the shadow is cast so it looks like, depending what season it is, that I forget what god it is. It's like ascending and descending the pyramid. Or,
I never heard that. That's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, something to look into. And there was a lunar.
No, I've heard that too.
Yeah, you know about that?
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Uh-huh. And I've noticed pyramid cultures tend to endorse slavery quite a bit. And I studied a lot of the pyramids of North America, which is another talk. And there's some in Alabama and Georgia. In the city of Georgia, the capital of Georgia, Atlanta, has numerous pyramidal structures. You know, the corporate headquarters of several companies are there, CNN and Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines. And downtown is just a series of pyramids. And I've observed that seems to be part of cultures who are very much involved in slavery and such. This is Palenque, and I was looking at that picture and thinking, oh yeah, when we did ceremonies I got to stand right there. So, Palenque, the tomb of Pakal, and a lot of information has been discovered about Mayan language and timekeeping through that discovery. And Pakal, Chichen Itza is called the astronomer's temple, and it's at 90 degrees longitude. And here are two pyramids, one of them right up the road from us, that are also on 90-degree longitude. So the large one here is Cahokia in St. Louis, right on the Mississippi River. And this smaller one here is in Ashland, Wisconsin. And it's now recognized that this site is clearly a child of that site, which was at its peak in like 500 years ago.
Where's that one in Wisconsin?
It's at Lake Mills, Wisconsin, just outside Madison.
Yeah.
And I've done ceremonial work there, and there used to be a wonderful group at Cahokia that was a guardian. I've noticed that many of these sites have people who are involved with them, who are psychically, spiritually attuned to them and work with them. And he ran a circle for a long time, and he lived right across the street. And that was after and we used to work with aligning these three sites, Wisconsin, Missouri, and the pyramid at Chichen Itza, because we were right on the same alignment. And in terms of Lake Mills, this one here, they could have parked their community right on the the Mississippi River, but they didn't because it was 90 or 100 miles away from the alignment on the 90th parallel. So that's kind of interesting. And here's some more pyramids. These are in China. Many of them are in the province of Jian. And the thing I didn't mention about these two sites is they have wood hinges there that are very comparable, that mark Venus points. And I worked with the astronomers and surveyors, part of a group that does that, that they found the Venus points, which again shows an alignment in cultural and with Mayan practices of Mayan timekeeping. So continuing pyramids in China, which the Chinese government keeps trying to say don't exist, and stuff like that. And
That's what they plant trees.
they're quite gigantic. There's a whole history there. And I mean, we've been dealing with that forever, you know, the hidden history. Kind of now putting aside the pyramid structures, of which that's just a sample, returning to Egypt and some of the temple complexes there. This is Dendera, the Temple of Hathor, and very interesting, highly colored, and Hathor is the mother goddess, of course. And this is where that famous light bulb piece is at that site. And I have yet to see anyone who's got a good explanation of what's going on with that, but it is a very intriguing glyph where it looks like they're holding some sort of mechanical device or a glass tube like a light bulb with a filament through it, and then they're somehow connected to something, and then Ma, or well, Hathor, with somebody with a ball on top of the head, and then there's a Jed, J-D-E device, also touching the one unit and the other one's not, so he looks like some sort of polarity, positive, negative. But it's a very, it's as intriguing as the image of the helicopters, the Egyptian air vehicles, flying vehicles. And kind of a unique image of Hathor, the mother goddess, with this triangular face. And here is the zodiac from the point of view of Egypt, which is different than what we inherited from the Babylonians. And there's a nice pillar image with a Hathor figure, a goddess, passing a ball to someone. And it looks also like some unique kind of technology going on here. And that's the exterior of the temple. One of the things that's well known about this is it's kind of like it's like a library. And there's not much information on the geometry or the orientation of it, and I wasn't able to spend that research on that. This is another important site. It's Edfu, and this is devoted to Horus, who's the son of Isis and Osiris. And it's known for the hypo style, which is a forest of pillars. And there's one researcher who has a theory, because when he looks at the pillars in particular of Egypt, the tops of the pillars have four different flower types, and none of them are native to Egypt. They're more, like one of them is a lotus, and I forget what they are at the top of my head. But he proposes that the Egyptian culture came from what would be Malaysia or somewhere around there, the Lemurian culture possibly, and that this forest of pillars is a recognition or reenactment of their original home. The pillars also come up in the cistern and aqueducts, so that could be another possible explanation as well. So, but it's an interesting idea. And along with moving away from Egypt, and this is the ziggurat of Ur, and it's not even a full view of it, and the Temple of Isis at Hatra, and a figure, could be an angelic figure who's got wings and he's passing something that looks like a pine cone in that image. There's and it also looks like he's wearing a watch on his hand. Evidence of time traveling.
Well, like what he's holding, I've heard before too, that's like a cone that's supposed to represent the pineal gland as well.
Right, metaphorically it definitely does suggest that, but it could be a whole nother story. And some of these figures are also carrying a little handbag, as it's called. And I know, studying with Zechariah Sitchin, he talked about the goddess going up to, putting on her gear, putting on her spacesuit, flying up to the Godhead to get memes. And that's where the word meme came from, was from Zechariah Sitchin, who translated it. And now everybody who knows nothing about any of this is using that word meme. But he said that she would, when he translated that, she would go up to the Godhead to get a meme, and he considered memes knowledge and information or key. So sometimes when I see them with the handbags, I wonder, is that what is the container for the meme? Is it possibly, or it's like this, but that he opened that conversation up. Luxor at Karnak is another important Egyptian site, and this was to Amun, who was the renegade god, a late generation deity, and the conflict between Akhenaten was over his following of Atan and Amun. And this is a very interesting image of Amun, where he's standing at least 2.5 times, maybe it's a 1.6 ratio, over Horus, or who would be the person, the human who's the king, the pharaoh, and he's the god. And that was a very significant thing that happened with King Tut, was the diminution of Tut when he turned religions and became, reinstated the worship of Amun. And that was there's a very famous picture of Amun, all black, granite, and King Tut very small, like this form. But again, another pillar, set of pillars, and some images of gift giving. This is some values for the pyramid. I'm going to leave that, and we're going to scoot forward to Greece and look at Greek architecture and their use of possibly, in a way, I've been more collecting sites than being able to fully interpret them. But this is the Parthenon from an aerial view, and this is a temple of Apollo, and interesting. So pyramids are the Greek temples tend to be rectangular. They're about 30 to 100 feet. They're often using the proportions that we looked at with phi and the square root of 5. Sometimes they are circular. They always have a stepped base called a stylobite. Sometimes 2, sometimes 3 steps. Inside is a masonry built cell called a naos, or a hallway, which leads to a larger room called a cell, which is where the god, a statue of the god, would be. And these are usually windowless, and they may have a porch of pillars around it. And there would often be a second chamber called the antenos, which would be the treasury for the trophies and gifts. And so, being the conspiratorial seeking person I am, I started to say, so that's where like where we have this association of treasure with the temples, and so the riches that are accumulated that allow the work to continue. But usually the chambers are lit by large doorways or skylight, and then many of the services are done on the grounds around the temple itself. And the temples are also designated by how many pillars they have. And I don't know, in casual conversation, if something's noted as being 4, 6, or 8, but that's the general And there can be 2 pillars as well. And how many pillars? Do they go all the way around? Or are they just in the front and the back? So like this one has pillars in the front and the back. This one has pillars that go all the way around. This is like 4 rows. This is 6. And this, ones on the outside are 8. Columns and lintels are really a big deal with the Greek architecture. So standing on the stylobite is the row of columns. And they're really stacked drums on top of each other without mortar. Sometimes there might be a pin in them, and they're wider at the base and they taper. And this is called entasis. The tops of the columns have 2 parts. One rests on the lintel, and this is called the abacus. And the Icarus rises from the column. And there's the famous 3 order of columns. The Doric is the plane, indicated here. And then the Ionic with the volutes or spirals. And then the Corinthian, which is the flower. I forget what flower it is, but it's only that one flower, and it's related to mythology. And the whole structure is represented here in this nice little glyph. So at the top of the pillar is a structure called the entablature, which has some layering, and then above that would be the frieze where sculptures are written indicating who the temple is about. And then the Piedmont is this triangular section that we've all seen here and there. And this is a different description of some of the pure temples that are still in existence in areas of Greece. Here's the Temple of Zeus at Athens. So it was basically a 3-pillar temple, and it was quite large. It was gigantic by some terms. And returning to the Parthenon, it was built in 500 BC. It depicts the Battle of Marathon, which was very important, where the Greeks fought against the Persians. And it's not only a religious building, we think of it as being white and kind of marble, but it was very bright and painted. And it had a shrine, a statue of Athena made of pure gold. And Pericles, who was the king, considered it his bank account. Again, this idea that temples were repositories of wealth, and where we keep our stash, to be kind of simplistic. So this is perhaps a little more verbiage than we need right now. But here's some images of the Parthenon from another view, and you can see how much decay it's been suffering. This is a statue of Athena that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and this was a replica of the gold Athenian. But there was a whole ritual around it. Throughout most of the year, it would be covered with cloth, and they bring it out, they'd uncover it, and for various ceremonies. And there was one where it was paraded through the town, and that was also a common ceremonial activity in Egypt. Another factor that's interesting and important is optical illusion. In the Parthenon, none of these are really perfectly straight, and it's kind of a strange philosophy or ingeniousness, but the design is such that from far away it looks straight and square, and that the natural things our eye would do, and perspective itself does when we look at something far away. So it's correcting for all of that. And the details of it are kind of intriguing, but you can see how these pillars, this is also that entasis where they're kind of bulging at the center. But they're not, none of them are the same distance from each other, and they're all compensating for the natural perspective changes that occur. This is the frieze, and then this would be where the images are, and in between are markers. This is a piece that shows the role of the golden mean or phi in the size. So right here is a key point, and if the Piedmont was complete, it would fill that space. And some other factors are calculated in that curve as well. Various people have done work on that. Another thing about looking at Athens itself is the idea of a sacred precinct. And so this is a view of a map showing that, and another view of the Parthenon. And here you can get that sense of how it's meant to be viewed from far away. And it's meant to make that statement that this is a place of beauty and order from far away can be seen. And you can almost kind of, when you know that some of these pillars are crooked, you can almost start to see it, that they're optically eluded so that they look perfectly straight when they in fact really shouldn't. So this is another site. This is Delphi, the famous Oracle of Delphi. There's not much left of it, but there was a chamber here where the reader would be on top, and it was kind of like, like suspended on this high platform, and to get to it was quite a challenge. Here's the Delphi Theater, and theaters were a very important part of Greek culture and public space. What's also very interesting is that the acoustics of these sites. And I like this next picture because you can kind of see the deep angle. And I've seen film where people stand here and they record at the top, and you can hear it quite well. And that is a part of ancient science that we've completely lost. And it seems kind of like simple, what do they call it, high concept. And there are people who are saying, no, it doesn't work. And but I've witnessed it, so that's an interesting example of it. Some of these sites have really survived pretty well. Vitruvius, who I mentioned earlier for the Vitruvian Man, this is from his book, and where he gives the proportions and the layout for how the Greek theater should be constructed. And interestingly, there's this pattern of cubes, a star-shaped figure relating. So there's some evidence of sacred geometry in the concept. And this is a quote from him. The angles at the bottom will give the directions for the flight of steps. Will be 7 in number, C, E, F, G, H, I, D. The other 5 angles will determine the arrangement of the scene. Thus the angle in the middle ought to have the royal door opposite to it in the angles. And it goes on. The steps for the spectators' places where the seats are arranged should be not less than 1.5 foot and a palm in height, no more than 1 foot and 6 fingers. Their depth should be fixed at not more than 2.5 feet, nor less than 2 feet. And so part of that angle is determined by that distance of the heights. And John Michel, who's we talked about, and who's done a lot of great work on measure, has gone into great lengths to figure out what a palm and a foot are and were. And there indeed were many ones. There's the Egyptian foot or the Egyptian cubit, and then there's the royal foot, the English foot, the imperial foot, and so there's a lot of debate about what it actually was. And that was actually an interesting study itself. This is Ephesus, which was a really significant site in the Mediterranean. And here's a description of the whole complex. And this is said to be a mask of Agamemnon. Along with the theater and the temple, the gymnasium was an important part of Greek culture. And it was something that was only for men. And another site was the Bouleuterion, which was like the public forum. And so these were sites where people, the citizens, would gather and pass laws and adjudicate crimes. And the Romans inherited from the Greeks. And probably one of the most significant sites is the Roman Pantheon in the city of Rome. This was built by Hadrian, and it means honor all gods, and it's quite an amazing site. You can go video it, watch video of it if you can't go there, and it has a dome in it. So this one is an example of squaring the circle, and it really mixes the features of a square with the circle. And here's some images of it. The only light is from the oculus at the top. So there's no windows in here, and it's lit that way. And a lot of alignments occur. It does align to significant equinox points, as well as just there's a day in April when it illuminates a particular statue in a certain eve in the space. This thing is over 2,000 years old, and it's an incredible work, and it's still standing. And along with that, the Romans really were kind of colonizing the planet and spreading their idea of culture and civilization, and along with that went building. And Vitruvius. Sort of the hallmark of Roman work is the arch, and so here's an arched aqueduct, and here's an arched Colosseum, and an arch of triumph. So they had quite a few different uses for arches, and the basic form was there'd be the forum in the middle, and that'd be the marketplace, and then sites would be arranged around this central point, the basilica, which would be a government building, and temples to Jupiter and so on, and the gymnasium and the theater would all be arranged around that. Here's two interesting sites that still stand. The Temple of Vesta, which was a fire that was kept, the fire of heaven. And the Potawatomi Indians do that. They're called the fire keepers, and they have a sacred fire they keep going, which the Romans did. And this is the Temple of Augustus. I think it's a funerary temple built for him. And this is Bacchus's temple. A lot of pillars. Some examples of a Roman arch.
Excuse me, Jeanie. Very nice.
Thanks. See you next week, or in 2 weeks. And this is some information from Vitruvius on the principles of architecture. And I mean, they were no slouches in terms of the Roman Empire. And a big part of that story was the aqueduct and the management of water. So there's another example of water management. And our next progression then is from the fall of the Roman Empire to the rise of the Gothic and the cathedral. And so that's cathedral in Ireland. And the cathedrals emerged from the Knights Templars. They went to Jerusalem, fought the Muslims, dug for 9 years under the Temple Mount, and then they found something, apparently, and then they ran back to Europe and started building cathedrals, as the story goes, in a simple cartoon version. But then these incredible works become the mark of the medieval period, and it begins in France. This is the first cathedral, Saint Denis in Paris, which is for Dionysius, who was a martyr and a Catholic, a Christian. Part of the features that made these cathedrals so significant was the use of the stained glass window, and the instead of the Roman arch that was curved, they had the pointed arch, which allowed them to get more height in the building. So that was a key factor. And then, along with going higher, the use of the flying buttresses on the outside to support the wall, even though they were going higher, they still had to deal with the weight and the load-bearing factors of stone. And in this particular one, Saint Denis, is where many people in France get buried. And there's Saint Denis, Dionysius with his head. Kind of an interesting composition, and some of the stained glass work. Here's a typical cathedral floor plan. It starts out where it's, I gotta get my bearings. This is Amiens, and typically the entrance is at the west, and you you go toward the east, which is again illumination, and so this first area is called the facade in the west end. The central part here is called the nave. And then this center area on the sides is called the aisle, of course. And then this cross section is called the transept, and it looks like a cross. And of course there's a north and a south. And then the next thing is the choir. And then the apse where the altar is. 9 is the ambulatory, a section that goes around the altar where you can walk. And then these are small chapels within that area. And then this would be where the rose stained glass would be up in this end, sometimes on those sides as well. And my next slide is about analyzing the typical floor plan with the Vesica Pisces. So here are 2 circles drawn, and here's the intersection, which kind of comes out to be in this area, and then a triangle. So we see examples of that in the design. Good night, Kathleen. So this is just some examples of vaults and buttresses. So the buttresses supported the walls, and vaulting was just such a key part of Gothic design. And these high roofs were achieved through this business of combination of pillars used as piers, and then these angular curved or angular arches. It's quite amazing. And another look at some of the geometric forms. And so this is an example of the proportion and ratio in chart. So on the floor of chart is a labyrinth right there. And this is where the rose window is. So when we compare the height to the floor plan, they're exactly parallel. and the window matches up with that. So there is some deep math, deep proportion in this. And this is showing some of the orientation of the solstice for the labyrinth at Chartres Cathedral. Again, an astral alignment. This is just pictures of the interior. So here's the labyrinth. Here's a vault, stained glass images. They have a double rose window, a lot of blue. And here's the vaulted ceiling again. Pretty remarkable, these spaces. This last slide is about the Tree of Life and how it aligns with the floor plan of most of the cathedrals. Pretty much the same set of proportions at work. So it's not a comprehensive analysis, but I am finding some of the links. This is just, again, more about the Gothic arch, how it allowed the church to have more height, and it was borrowed from Islam or the Muslim world. And it has to do with the way that the weight is carried. So this is some other notable cathedrals. The top one is Sagada in Spain. This one is in Florence, Italy, and the left one is in, again, Spain, Santiago Compostela. And this is Winchester Cathedral and the Cathedral of Tours. So this is England right here. This is one of the largest ones. And the vault in this space is just incredible. I've read it also that some scholars make a connection with the idea of the vault really being an emblem of the feminine vagina, and that there's a whole lore akin to the pipe ceremony within the design of cathedrals. This is the cathedral of, in Washington, D.C. We've got flags, and again, the great height of it. And probably one of the most famous cathedrals, like the site in Rome. This is the Hagia Sophia Cathedral in Istanbul. And pretty remarkable space. Like many, it was at one time a mosque, and like many mosques, it has multiple spires, sort of this idea of five-figured star. And so this is the interior with the instead of a vault, it's a dome at the top, and then we can see these elongated arches building into the dome. And this is the cistern below the site, which is also pretty remarkable, and we're going to talk more about that shortly. And so this is some analysis of some of the geometry in the Hagia Sophia. So here are several intersecting circles, and it's more of a square. It's kind of like the other Roman, the Pantheon, squaring a circle. And it was built by Justinian. This is the cistern, but below it, it's amazing. It almost looks like something in a Star Trek movie. And, you know, this watered area for water management. An upside down head and the stairway into this space. And a really good book on sacred cathedrals and sacred geometry. Also, this work is looking at some of the factors having to do with squares. And here's an example of the Vitruvian Man from another artist. medieval artist as well. Another category is henges and circles. So there's Stonehenge, and this is the flower of life imposed, superimposed over the Stonehenge. And it's a pretty good matchup. And Stonehenge is part of a complex, and it's related to Glastonbury, which is a cathedral. And so this is a layout of the site. And there are a Vesica Pisces is found right in the middle of Glastonbury. And again, one could do a whole just review of what's going on with this site alone. Jean-Michel, he found, or he reported, so here's Stonehenge, and here's Arbor Low, and this other site, Burn, and that they form a 3-4-5 Pythagorean triangle. And so one of the things Jean-Michel found was to look in straight lines, but that often the sites that you see are connected to a larger construct in a larger area. And the same thing happens with looking at Native American Indian mounds. Like you may find a mound here, and then 10 miles away another mound, or maybe not even 10 miles, maybe 5 acres, and there's some communication between these henges and these circles happening. And often it's astronomical alignments that are being recorded. It's used to mark time, so we know when we come back next year what day it is and such. So this is a map showing Stonehenge, Glastonbury, Arbor Low, which is near Avebury, and the relationship to the sun. And my hat's off to these great geometricians who have observed and done the legwork to figure this out. In Ireland is some other sites of a similar nature, particularly the Hill of Tara. And this is a cairn or mound. And I have the good fortune to be friends with the keeper of this site. And this is a little metal door here. And the local DNR person, the Department of Natural Resources, has given him a key to that door for the sacred site. And he does research and occasionally takes people there, worthy people. But there are alignments in this site, kind of like almost a kiva, where there's some pinpoint things where the light comes in and illuminates a rock or something inside. And this is a small Irish henge in that area of Tara. This is quite large. It's an aerial view. You can see the people. And another type of site that I mentioned is the Hopi, the kiva. So that's what a kiva looks like inside. And again, a beam of light coming in, illuminating something at a key point. And here's an entrance into the kiva, a ladder. So it might just look like, just kind of a little flat piece of land in the village, or maybe it's outside the village. And this is an antique picture of a ceremony at a kiva in the 19-teens or 20s. And this is a kiva that's got a T-square in it, and that's a very common image in a lot of Latin Americans, and many of more and more of the Hopi are recognizing ancestry cultural with the Mayans. Here is a medicine wheel. This is in Little Bighorn. And it's quite substantial. It's maybe one of the largest ones in America. And a Lakota wheel, that's the same one from a different view. This is a Lakota wheel, and this is an Iroquois wheel, and some of the basic symbol color schemes. The Lakota one's really beautiful. And here's a labyrinth, and this is a rock labyrinth, and that's a replica of Chartres Cathedral labyrinth. It's interesting, I counted the steps from in here, and it was exactly 500 steps. And when you do a whole labyrinth, it's a half a mile. Or no, it's a half a mile in and it's half a mile out. Of course, when I'm talking, I'm not doing fine math, so I could have to double check fact check on that one. But anyway, so another feature within architecture is patterns and geometric forms. So these are some samples. Pretty amazing. The castle of Samazzano in Tuscany. And these are various rooms. It's one of the most exotic places on the planet, probably. This is a Baha'i temple in New Delhi, and it's very interesting. And they're working with the arch in a different way. And this is the mosque, or Pink Mosque, in Shiraz, Iran. Very beautiful. This is a Spanish synagogue this is a Spanish synagogue. I don't know how I got the word Spanish in there. If it's in Czechoslovakia, I might have to do a fact check on that. But very interesting space. Again, with vaulted ceilings. And this is probably the continuation of the other screen. This is a synagogue. And this is a mosque in Uzbekistan. And certainly
Is it the ceiling?
yeah. It certainly is hypnotic and makes us think higher thoughts. This is Canterbury Cathedral, and this is also a series of vaults, how they come together. And I think this is a type of photography that is new, that can make things come together like that. I don't know the word for it. And this is a Hindu site. It has a lot of complexity and symmetry. And here's another view of Canterbury. And there's the Pope's cross in the center there. It's incredible to think of the kind of work and thinking that went into these sites. This is the Templar Temple in London, and it's a modest place. And here it is from the outside, a little round building. So the Templars always built round structures. So most of the cathedrals are rectangular, but the Templars always drew circles. And this is part of the interior of their circular space. And this is a little map of Templar mechanics and London sites, which I haven't had time to study in detail, but I thought it was interesting. So this is like a breakdown of the mysterious secret sites in London. We have Hindu sites. This is probably one of the largest temples in India. This is a very ornate one. I've got the 6 parts of a temple: the dome, the chamber, the hall, the porch, the reservoir, and the walkway. And this is an amazing place. The pillars in this temple are musical, and it's a lost art that they could make this place resonate and sing. And even in the front is a chariot at the entrance to this site. And they have no idea, well, they have some ideas, but they think that the rock was somehow reconstituted. They put it in a thing and they spun it. But they're able to get different frequencies, which means that they change the density of the rock. to get different sounds. And that is what's hard to understand. This is a temple that was just in the news yesterday, Sambromila Temple. And it has historically been closed to women of menstruating age. And there was a Supreme Court ruling that they were going to open it up so women could attend. They want to. And the men were obstructing them, and some women too, from entering this really popular temple. But it's all about the convenience and the preference of the men, after all, isn't it? They don't want to be offended and bothered by that. So, here is another set of temples in India, southern India mostly, very ornate, and right in the middle of the public square. And I thought we looked at this one already. Here's interiors, very beautiful, very ornate. And again, this is a site that is known for its intricately carved figures all the way up and down, and some of them are very lurid. And it's one of the more randy Hindu sites. And it's famous, Khajuraho Temple. So another idea about temples is that they should emulate a mountain, and we see that a lot in the Buddhist temples. So this is a square surface, and it has 72 stupas at the top, and it's almost like a ziggurat. So this is kind of where the Middle East and Mesopotamia met with the ancient world and the Hindus. It's very reminiscent of that stuff. Here's some images of the Buddha at the top of that site. And here's what it looks like when you enter it. It reminds me of the ziggurat. This is Angkor Wat, another large site. It's one of the largest in the world. It's a temple complex. And beautifully carved figures. The site is being taken over by the trees. As you can see here, the roots are growing over the stone buildings. And here's a picture of the whole layout of the site and its place in the world. Harnessing water is something that occurs at Angkor Wat. There's a natural bridge, and they call it the bridgehead, and the water rushes through. So this is another place where example of how water management is related to the site, this holy place, and which we saw at the cistern in the site at Turkey, Sofia. This is Lhasa, Tibet, a very famous headquarters of Tibetan Buddhism. And these are other smaller Buddhist sites on the top of a mountain. Some in India, some in Tibet. This is a bit about Chinese temples, and here's a very early temples of Buddhist form. They have the stupa inside. So this is also reminiscent of that ringing pillars that we looked at in India. And this is and Buddhism originated in India, so this is actually an Indian site. And the bell-shaped stupa is inside. And here's an example of a classic, modern, recently built stupa. So they have various layers representing and symbolizing different aspects. A stupa was always sort of a repository when somebody important died. Either their belongings or relics, text, cut of their hair, maybe their bones would be placed inside here. And so they're memorials. Here's 8 different kinds of stupas. Here's an arched, vaulted, and So this goes into, what ideal are we emanating at that particular location. Usually stupas are also meant to be circumambulated, where you go around it 7 times in a clockwise manner as a way of honoring the person there. This is the temple of Confucius. There's many of them actually. This is one of the more famous ones in China. This is a very interesting site in China. It's called Heaven's Gate, and this is more like from the shamanistic, Taoist perspective. So there's still evidence of some of this in China, but it's a gigantic hole in this mountain, and people pilgrimage through it, and a road was made through it. And so that's sort of that Romanesque conquer nature. Okay, and here's the grand entrance to this spot right down there in the corner. This is another famous temple called the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. And this is where they believe the navel of the world is.
Everybody's got their own navel.
Yeah, everyone does, don't they? And it's an incredible site, and it was part of for 500 years it was maintained, and the emperors would make their obeisance to the gods and keep the plants growing and the rainfall. But an incredible site, and the history of that's kind of unique. These are some sites that are in danger. This is the Buddha of Bamiyan in Afghanistan, and we should probably wrap it up. I probably have a few more, but here's Solomon's Temple where it all began, and some of the layout of Solomon's Temple is almost like a cathedral with a transept at the front rather than the back. And what's interesting is that in the lore of the Temple of Solomon is imagery of the Ark of the Covenant that looks like something from King Tut's tomb. So this is from King Tut's tomb, and it's angels, and it's very much like the angels are described on the Ark of the Covenant. And of course that's where we get the Merkaba, and when the angels' 4 wings touch, that's like room where we fired up the engine. And I don't know if you can see that, and it's very interesting. There's this place where the sound gets carried. You can see the angel wings are intersecting there. And another interesting study, dimensions of the temple we don't have time for. Again, the idea of the temple as a seat of divine presence where God lives. And that's a very important thing, and distinction between the temple and the synagogue. The synagogue is, in Judaism, a place where people assemble. It's where the prayer books are kept, and they're elaborately contained in a cabinet, but it is not the place where God resides. And the place where God resides is in the Ark of the Covenant. And so that's different from a temple. And here's some examples of some outstanding synagogues. This is in Manhattan, the Eldridge Street, and this is one in Russia. This is, now we're looking at mosque actually. This is a mosque in Russia, and this is a mosque in Spain. And this is in Abu Dhabi. Again, that 4 spires in the central point. And Islamabad. This is continuing looking at the one in Islamabad. Very beautiful. And finally, in terms of Islam, the Kaaba is the most important relic. And it's this gigantic box at Mecca. And to call it a box is not the right word, but as you can see, it is square, and it has significance for that. Here's a very old Turkish tapestry showing the Kaaba that some say predates Muhammad, that the Kaaba is older than even Islam. And here's the Dome of the Rock, where the Temple Mount was said to be. And this is a water wheel because this is one of the last water wheels in Syria. And it was for an aqueduct that still functioned into the 20th century. And this is also a mosque in Baghdad that is in danger. It's almost 2,000 years old, and it's in danger. So reading the scrolls, doing the math, I'm starting to see the significance of water to temples, and that many of these sites had water elements, cisterns, irrigation, water wheels, the Hopi, the Hagia Sophia, the Roman aqueduct, Angkor Wat, Egypt, and the Mesopotamians. And here's a nice temple in India with a gigantic pond that was for water management. So this idea of the water seems to be part of the story. And there's this theory that these ancient civilizations really functioned because of what this author calls, Carl August Woodford, hydraulic empires. And I think there's really something to that. So the principles of sacred architecture are site selection, orientation, alignments, spatial sequence, the principle of beauty, archetypes, geometry, and infrastructure and power. So with that, my last word is, it's the water, stupid. remember Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. And so that seems to be what really drove the ancient world, was the ability to manage water. And here we are in Wisconsin looking at Foxconn coming in and trying to take all our water. And my last thought to leave you with is the earth itself is a temple, and the earth is sacred, and we should take care of her. So, thanks everyone.